They wore masks like skin, smiled with teeth that meant nothing, laughed with eyes that never reflected joy. Their entire presence was a performance, a carefully choreographed illusion stitched together with guilt, silence, charm, and the occasional weaponized vulnerability. They thrived on being misunderstood, just enough to avoid accountability, and just charismatic enough to stay adored. But then you stopped watching the stage and looked behind the curtain. You saw the pulleys, the wires, the sweat. You saw through everything. And that's why they're terrified, not because you exposed them publicly, but because you saw them privately. And you didn't flinch. You didn't react. You didn't scream. You simply stopped playing along. And that stillness, that quiet seeing, was a death sentence for the image they'd spent years trying to perfect. They once believed you were naive. They mistook your softness for blindness, your kindness for ignorance. They thought if they gave you just enough affection to taste, you'd never stop hungering for their validation. But you didn't starve. You studied. You took notes. Not the loud kind, the surgical kind. You watched them shift when someone more powerful entered the room. You noticed how their morals bent to convenience, how their apologies were always rehearsed. You recognized the micro-inches in their face when your intuition inched closer to their truth. And while they thought they were conditioning you to depend on them, you were documenting the architecture of their deception. You didn't just catch the lies, you traced the why. And no manipulator survives that kind of insight. They see you now and don't know which version of themselves you're looking at. That's the fear, the paralysis. Because when someone sees through your tactics, your script, your character, you're left with nothing but self. And for toxic people, the self is unbearable. They crafted personas, not for expression, but for escape. Escape from the rot, from the emptiness, from the unworthiness. They buried beneath performance. And when you stood in front of them with eyes that didn't worship but understood, you became a mirror they can't forgive. Not because you hated them, but because you didn't. You saw it all, and still you chose yourself. Psychologically, the manipulator only survives when their target is willing to abandon their own reality. But you didn't. You returned to yours with conviction, with fire. You stopped asking, "What if I'm wrong?" and started asking, "What if they knew exactly what they were doing?" That shift, that's when fear was born in them. Because now, every word they say is filtered through your clarity. Every game they play is dissected in real time. They're no longer mysterious, they're predictable. And when a person built their entire worth on being unreadable, being known feels like exposure. You didn't just see their mask, you made it irrelevant. They retreat now, cloaked in avoidance. They'll call you difficult, cold, bitter, but beneath the labels is trembling, because you know the patterns. You've studied the emotional mechanics. You've seen the rehearsed wounds, the baited arguments, the manufactured chaos. You don't just walk away from them, you outgrow them. And nothing devastates a control addict more than watching the person they tried to sculpt into dependence grow wings. You learned how to soar in silence, and now they watch you from the ground, pretending not to see the one thing that terrifies them, a witness who won't lie for them anymore. They miss your confusion, your questions, your panic in their absence. But now, you're no longer afraid of losing them. You're disgusted by the idea that you ever feared that to begin with. They didn't offer safety. They offered addiction. Dopamine disguised as love. And now that you're clean, they know you're not coming back. That's what keeps them up at night. Not your anger, not your revenge, but your clarity. You've become someone they can't rewrite. Someone whose silence makes more noise than all their empty words combined. You are their unfinished story. Not because you disappeared, but because you saw how it was going to end and walked out of the theater. They can no longer depend on your confusion to validate their behavior. That's what turns their stomach now, because clarity robs them of narrative. You aren't recounting the story with edits. You're not rewriting it to make them look kinder, or yourself look smaller. You're telling the truth, even if it's only to yourself. And that truth dismantles everything they built. They weren't the misunderstood hero. They were the author of dysfunction. You were never broken. You were gaslit into questioning your inner compass, but it kept pointing north. And now you walk with direction, while they spin in the dissonance of being seen and left behind. You are a threat now, not because you did anything cruel, but because you carry knowledge. You walk with receipts. You hold the blueprint to their manipulation, and they know it. They can't charm you anymore. They can't bait you. They can't guilt you into reopening a door you bolted shut. They don't fear confrontation. They fear your composure, your refusal to need them, your disinterest in being liked. That's the real danger. When someone you tried to dominate no longer fears exile, because they've built a home inside themselves where your voice no longer echoes. They dragged your name through every hallway they could find, whispered poison into ears eager to sip it. They painted you with crude strokes, exaggerated every flaw, inverted your intentions, and called it truth. But what they really did was confess. People only slander what they fear cannot be controlled. You were too aware, too raw, too unwilling to play dumb for their comfort. So they tried to bury you with their words, to rewrite the memory of you while the ink was still wet. They slandered your name, not because you failed them, but because you saw them and kept standing. And now that the dust has settled, now that the rooms they poisoned begin to echo with questions, they whisper that same name, not in pride, not in hatred, but in fear. Because the one they tried to erase is still here. They underestimated the gravity of your silence. See, they were prepared for revenge, for outbursts, for breakdowns. That's the story they wanted. The one where you crumbled and they looked strong in comparison. But instead, you went quiet, focused. You let them talk. You let them spin their stories while you sharpened your character in private. And the silence made them nervous. It always does. Because silence means control. It means calculation. And now that you've emerged, colder, clearer, sharper, they fear the echo of your name. Not because you're seeking justice, but because you are justice. Your existence alone disproves their fiction. Your peace mocks their need to control the narrative. You didn't have to destroy them, you just had to survive. And you did. You became the one they hope no one brings up, the topic that curdles their tongue. Because if someone were to really ask what happened between you two, they'd have to stammer through a maze of contradictions. Their slander doesn't age well. Lies rarely do. The people who once listened to them now begin to watch you. And you, without a single plea or campaign, have become credible simply by being consistent. There's no anger in your eyes now, just a kind of knowing that stings worse than vengeance. They whisper your name like it might summon you, like it might draw eyes they cannot explain themselves to. That's how fear works. It wears the mask of silence, and it sweats under the weight of exposure. At the time, you didn't know what they were doing. You just felt the shift, the cold shoulders, the side glances, the way people's eyes darted away when you walked in. They had already begun crafting your reputation behind your back, painting you as unstable, aggressive, jealous, ungrateful, anything that would draw attention away from their own mess. It wasn't just about hurting you, it was about preserving themselves. That's how cowards work. They kill the witness before the trial begins. They didn't want people to see what you had seen. So they tried to turn you into a caricature before anyone had the chance to listen. But the truth has a patience that ego cannot survive. And now, The same people who once scoffed at your name now hesitate when they hear it. Because time has proven your integrity, not through drama, but through endurance. You didn't lash out. You didn't beg to be understood. You simply kept moving. You kept growing. And that's what makes them whisper now. Because a slandered name that refuses to collapse becomes a legend. It becomes too heavy to hold lightly, too powerful to speak without consequence. You turned their fiction into your fuel. They gave you a villain's mask, and you built a kingdom with it. And now, every corner they speak in becomes a confessional booth. They thought their words were weapons, but words without truth rot in the air. They become a stench, not a sword. And now their stories smell like desperation. People notice the inconsistency, the bitterness, the fact that years later they still speak your name with more venom than reason. While you don't speak of them at all. That's the real power. You became the silence they can't compete with, the dignity they cannot mimic. And so they whisper, not because you're a threat to their safety, but because you're a threat to their story. Psychologically, slander is an act of projection. It's the manipulator's last attempt to control how they are seen, by destroying how you are remembered. But you broke that cycle. You didn't fight back in the arena they designed. You built your own stage. And every step you took outside of their smear campaign reminded the world that authenticity outlasts propaganda. You no longer walk with the need to defend. You walk with the authority of someone who knows who they are. And more importantly, who knows who they are. That's what shakes them now. The fear that people are starting to wonder if you were right all along. You hold power now not because you silenced them, but because you never needed to shout over them. You became proof that survival is the most poetic response to betrayal. That walking away is a paragraph louder than any monologue they rehearsed. And now, they wonder what you know. They wonder if you'll ever speak. They wonder who you've told. That's the irony. They called you dramatic, but they're the ones living in paranoia. They write your name in lowercase now. They say it quickly, hoping it won't echo. But it always does. Let them whisper. Let them tremble. You no longer need to correct the record. Your life is the correction. You didn't just survive the character assassination. They failed to realize they wrote the wrong ending. You weren't the downfall. You were the mirror, and they flinched. They attacked the reflection and hoped it would stop showing them the truth. But mirrors don't bleed. And now, every time your name touches their lips, it stings. Not because of what you did, but because of what you endured without becoming them. They slandered your name. Now they whisper it in fear. And that is justice. Quiet, relentless, divine.